In the mid to late 1930s, a monster lurked in Cleveland, Ohio. This twisted creature did not stop at simply taking lives, but would dismantle the victims, leaving the parts to be found in a neighborhood called Kingsbury Run. There were at least 13 men and women who fell prey to this unidentified evil, with many more suspected to be related to the case. The horrific things that were done to the bodies led these crimes to captivate and terrify even to this day. The victims' heads were removed and in some cases never found, and their bodies were cut into pieces, leading to the ominous nickname given to the monster by the press. Despite advances in forensic technology, many of the victims have never been identified. This is compounded by the fact that the area where these events occurred was occupied by homeless and vulnerable people. Due to the amount of time that has passed, it is unlikely that police will ever identify the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. During the 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties as they are sometimes called, Cleveland was a growing city. Immigrants were coming to fill the manufacturing and industrial jobs that made up the city's economy. Wealthy individuals sponsored educational and cultural development, and the future looked bright. Then came the stock market crash of 1929. Along with the market crash, there was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which passed in 1930 that crippled international trade in an attempt at protecting American industry. As things started to collapse, many people tried to pull their money out of failing banks, which accelerated the damage to the economy as banks began to fail. The bank runs would lead to the creation of the FDIC in 1933, which protects a person's account balance up to a certain dollar amount to avoid any future bank runs. Amidst all this, the people were suffering as their money dried up and jobs disappeared. To make matters worse, a series of dust storms ravaged farmlands and created the Dust Bowl. Suffice to say, the 1930s were a rough time to be alive in America. But things for the residents of Cleveland were about to get worse as a series of horrific crimes came to light in the Kingsbury Run neighborhood. The area had become a hobo jungle or shanty town during the Great Depression. With unemployment levels reaching as high as 24.9%, these neighborhoods of shacks began popping up as desperate families put together makeshift shelters to weather the economic turmoil. Kingsbury Run was an especially good location, as there were train tracks that ran through it, offering transportation to those willing to jump a freight train. On one end of the run, shady operators saw a source of income, as we see in poverty-stricken neighborhoods today, and opened bars, brothels, gambling houses, and flop houses, which were essentially super cheap hotels with appalling conditions. The neighborhood had already had a bad reputation for crime and violence, but a year into the Great Depression, a different sort of crime would overshadow everything and terrify the city. The first body was found on September 5, 1934. A woman's torso was discovered on the shore of Lake Erie. The head, arms, and upper torso had been removed and the legs were cut off at the knee. Subsequent searches for her head were not successful, though additional body parts were reported to have been seen in the water. Because this victim was never identified, she was nicknamed the Lady of the Lake, a reference to the legend of King Arthur. There was little for investigators to go on. She had a surgery scar from a hysterectomy, which was common at the time. Otherwise, there was nothing, aside from the chemical lime chloride that had been put on the skin. Likely this was an attempt to accelerate decomposition, but it instead preserved the remains, making the skin leathery and tough. While the Lady of the Lake has not been definitively connected to the other homicides in this series, the similarities make it extremely likely. The body was found in nearly the exact same place as a later victim, who also had the same chemical applied to her skin. Just over a year after the Lady of the Lake was found, another body surfaced. Edward Anthony Andrassy was a 29-year-old man who had spent some time working at an asylum, but was unemployed at the time he lost his life. His remains were found in a ditch along East 49th Street on the edge of the Kingsbury Run. Andrassy's head had been removed and buried near his body, and his wrists had rope burns where he had been restrained. An autopsy determined that he had been dead for 2 to 3 days prior to being discovered. Nearby, another body was found, but like the Lady of the Lake, this victim remains unidentified. Once again, the head had been removed, and it appeared as though someone had tried to set it on fire. On January 26 of 1936, the remains of another woman were discovered wrapped in newspaper and loaded into baskets. The baskets were found left next to the Hart Manufacturing Company building. But not all of the body was found until February 7th, when the rest of the woman was found, excluding her head, in a vacant lot nearby. Using fingerprints, investigators were able to identify the woman as 44-year-old Florence Genevieve Polio, who had worked as a waitress, and some reports also have her being a lady of the night. at the time she lost her life to the deranged monster lurking in Cleveland. She had last been seen alive as she left the neighborhood bar. 6 months later, another body was found, this time near the East 55th Street Bridge, on June 5, 1936. While the name of this victim is unknown, he would be remembered as the Tattooed Man due to a handful of them on his body. He had a cartoon character called Jiggs on his left calf, an anchor and cupid on his right calf, a woman's name and dove on his right arm, a butterfly on the right shoulder. On his right arm he had crossed flags as well as a heart with an arrow through it. These tattoos were recreated and presented to the public in an effort to get an ID for the man, but they were not successful. The body was stripped nude and his head was found close by near some train tracks. Due to the lack of blood at either of the two scenes, investigators concluded that he had been mutilated elsewhere, then dumped there post-mortem. The only clue to the culprit was a Cadillac seen near the dump sites the night before the body was discovered. An autopsy revealed that the tattooed man had been alive when he was decapitated, and there was no evidence of restraints, drugs, or alcohol in his system, which is odd as it begs the question as to how someone was able to do such a horrific thing to a person without them trying to fight or flee. The next John Doe was found on July 22, 1936, near a homeless camp in Big Creek, just outside of Cleveland, by a teenager. He had also been decapitated and left to decompose, with his head being no more than a skull found nearby. The level of decay would make fingerprinting and therefore identification impossible, and missing persons reports from the area were of no help. This would be one of the only victims to be found away from Kingsbury Run. However, the large amount of dried blood in the area points to this being where his life was taken, and possibly where the other victims had met their ends as well prior to being dumped by Lake Erie. It was estimated that the remains had been out in the elements for at least 2 months. Like so many of these cases, the only thing investigators knew was that the victim was a person down on their luck. In this case, the man was a homeless drifter around 40 years old, suspected of riding in and out of town on the passing freight trains. In the fall of 1936, the coroner would arrange a meeting with the police and other specialists in what the papers would refer to as the Torso Clinic. The goal was to see if they could put their heads together to review the case and find anything that they could use to figure out something about the elusive killer. Police had also begun walking the streets dressed as transients in an attempt to draw out the perpetrator. The Mad Butcher was not done for the year, with the pace of the crimes leading one to wonder if during the pause between the early homicides, whether the creature was simply operating in another location. In September, a man going to hop a train on East 37th Street stumbled over a torso, and a pair of legs were found floating in a nearby open sewer. It was around this time that famed lawman Elliot Ness became involved in the case. Ness had risen to fame with his team of untouchables in their investigation of Al Capone. An autopsy found some very troubling details about the latest body found in Kingsbury Run. The coroner found that the head had been removed expertly in one quick stroke in a very specific location between vertebrae to cut through the joints rather than cutting through solid bone. The lack of miscuts showed that the culprit had practiced what he was doing and was comfortable committing these heinous acts and knowledgeable of the human body. The victim was a man in his mid-20s who had lost his life when his head was removed. In this case, he had also had his manly parts sliced off. 5 months later, on February 23, 1937, the upper half of a woman's torso was found on the shore of Lake Erie in almost the exact same location as where the Lady of the Lake had been found. The unknown woman was about 25 to 30 years old, and 3 months later, the lower half of her torso was found washed to shore, but the head, arms, and legs were never found. This case stands out from the rest for 2 primary reasons. First, there were multiple small cuts or hesitation cuts instead of the sure and efficient strokes on prior victims. Based on the autopsy, it was also determined that the head had been removed post-mortem, which stands out against the other cases. Both lungs were found to contain water, which may point to drowning as the cause of death. There was not another event in Cleveland until June 6, 1937. A partially buried set of body parts was discovered in a burlap sack underneath the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. The torso and skull were tentatively identified as a 40-year-old woman of the night named Rose Wallace, though the remains were little more than a skeleton. If it was Rose, she would be the only African-American victim of the Mad Butcher. Miss Wallace had disappeared on August 21st of the prior year, but the identification is far from certain. However, the level of decomposition was consistent with the timeline of Miss Wallace's disappearance. One strange aspect of this case is that one of the ribs was missing from the skeleton. but whether it was taken by the Mad Butcher or it simply fell out of the sack is unknown. The next body was found on July 6, 1937. This would mean another significant period of time passed without a victim, or again, the more likely, the creature was in another part of the country doing the same horrific stuff there. On July 6, the upper half of a man's torso stuffed into a chicken feed sack and a pair of upper legs were found floating in the Cuyahoga River. The victim was a white male around 40 years old. Just over a week later, the lower half of his torso was found. The head and some internal organs were savagely ripped from the body and never found. The coroner would note how viciously the insides had been stripped out, in stark contrast to the concise exactness of prior cuts. Several months would pass before the creature would take another victim in Cleveland. On April 8, 1938, a woman's leg was found with evidence of what was referred to as enraged dismemberment. The rest of her was found a month later in early May in a burlap sack, but as with so many of these victims, her head was never found. Investigators determined that the latest victim was a white female in her 20s or 30s. Once again, it appeared as though the Mad Butcher was living up to his nickname more and more with each victim. The cuts were no longer targeted and clean, and there were minor lacerations from indecisive initial strokes of his blade. A few months later, on August 16, 1938, the full body of a woman in her 20s and a man in his 30s were found in close proximity to one another at the corner of East 9th Street and Lakeside. As with the prior cases, the woman had been cut into pieces, but unlike the other victims, nothing was missing. Her body parts had been wrapped in newspaper and stuffed in boxes and bags. The man's remains included only the skull and skeletal torso, with the skull found in a can on the scene. Both were found to have expired due to the removal of their heads, though the woman was estimated to have lost her life a few months after the man, so it seems that the bodies had been stored somewhere unless they somehow went unnoticed out in the open. These latest discoveries seem to have lit a fire under Elliot Ness. There was little progress in the case up to this point, but after the remains were found within sight of his office, he escalated things. On August 18th, 2 days after the grisly discovery, Ness and 35 police officers descended on Kingsbury Run in force with the fire department backing them up. They arrived just after midnight in 11 police cars, 2 police vans, along with 3 fire trucks, and swept into the blighted neighborhood. The group moved through the shantytown, grabbing any men who caught their eye, then searched for any clues that might point to the suspect. Then, when all was said and done, they burned down the makeshift houses in what seems like an unnecessary act of cruelty. The raid on Kingsbury Run did little to calm the fears of Cleveland, and instead resulted in harsh criticism of Ness, and rightfully so. No strong suspects were found that night, and none would be until 1939. In July, the county sheriff, Martin O'Donnell, arrested a 52-year-old bricklayer named Frank Dolezal, who confessed while in police custody. Initially arrested for the homicide of Florence Polillo, it was found that Dolezal had lived with at least 3 of the other victims. But when authorities went to confirm his confession a second time, they got little more than insane ramblings peppered with oddly specific details, giving the impression that he had been coached on what to say. And before the trial, he was found hanged in his cell. His autopsy would cast more doubt on both his confession and death, as he had several broken ribs that were fresh enough that it was likely they were broken while he was in custody. Few, if any, believed that he was behind the killings, but Ness did hint that he knew the identity of the Mad Butcher. Francis E. Sweeney was a doctor and surgeon who lived in Cleveland during the crimes of the Mad Butcher, and it is believed that this is who Ness was referencing when he said that he was sure he knew who was behind the horrific acts in Kingsbury Run. He was on the police's radar, but they were not able to build up enough evidence to charge him. He was actually interrogated by Ness and other investigators, but refused to confess. Ness would say that Sweeney had failed a polygraph during this time, but due to a lack of physical evidence and political connections, he was not prosecuted. In late August of 1938, Sweeney had himself committed to an asylum where he would stay until 1965, and the investigation into him hit a dead end. However, someone signing his name as Dr. Sweeney would send taunting letters to Ness until his death in 1957. One of the letters sent to Ness claimed that the author had left Cleveland and moved to California. The letter would say that he had claimed a victim in LA and buried the head on a street corner. However, when the corner was dug up, only animal bones were found. The correspondence and similarities between the crimes lead some to believe that the Mad Butcher was also behind the Black Dahlia murder, due to the author having claimed that he moved to California. I personally find it hard to argue against this as a possibility. At least one article said that this was impossible due to the violent and aggressive way that Elizabeth Short had been cut up. But the violence had been escalating and the precision declined in Cleveland, so it would make sense that in 1947, the creature would be even more vicious and manic. However, the crimes of the Mad Butcher are unsolved to this day with no strong leads or any solid connections to other homicides, who some believe are part of this series. Even Dr. Sweeney seems unlikely as the culprit, as Elliot Ness would certainly have arrested him if he had enough evidence. After all, he helped take down Al Capone for tax evasion when the other crimes could not be proven in court. So why would he let this case slide? Surely Sweeney must have committed some minor infraction that Ness could have used to get him behind bars. To me, this case is right up there, if not worse, than the crimes of Jack the Ripper that took place about 50 years prior. Yet, for some reason, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run receives far less attention. And after all these years, one has to wonder, what was done with the missing heads?